This podcast is brought to you by ProLongevity, the award-winning 8-week program that can transform the lives of people with prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and many other lifestyle-related illnesses. Founded by Phillips, the pharmacist who gave up drugs.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the ProLongevity podcast. And I am absolutely delighted today to welcome someone who I followed for a very long time and feel like, we've only just met face to face today on a Zoom, but I feel like I've known him forever. Gary Fettke, who's an Australian surgeon who has had a very interesting journey that embraces everything from surgical amputation of limbs in people with out of control diabetes to being taken apart by the health system to everything from the Seventh-day Adventists to the cereal industry and medical education. And in fact, there are so many different themes that we could pick up today. There's no way we can do justice to all of it. So we're going to try and do a little taster and just to see where we end up. So Gary, welcome and thanks so much for joining us.
Well, it's good to catch up, Graham. I've been following you on Twitter, and I think there's been a few text messages and tweets between us over the years, and emails, and here we are. So it's good to see you. I mean, neither of us are particularly pretty, so I'm really sorry to the audience. Can we just go to audio?
Well, they always say I've got a great face for radio, and I kind of wanted to start with your role as a surgeon, because people talk about, I've got a little bit of diabetes. And I don't, because it's become almost the norm to be diabetic or pre-diabetic, I don't think people take it seriously enough until something goes horribly wrong. And it's the point that Ivor Cummins often makes around cardiovascular disease, that for a lot of people, the first time they know they've got a cardiovascular problem is they have a heart attack. And the problem with that is on a third of occasions, they don't survive it. So it's kind of a bit late.
Well, they've actually been symptomatic well and truly before that. They just probably didn't recognise the symptoms. Exactly. And the system isn't making people aware of those.
Exactly. The system, completely agree with you. So perhaps if we could talk first about your role as a surgeon and how diabetes has played into that and what conclusions you've drawn.
Diabetes as a major part of my clinical practice, because it didn't exist there 30 years ago. And it was a certain number of people, and they were generally pretty unhealthy. And by the time you've got diabetic complications in orthopedics, then that's pretty significant. And we're talking about, and in that time frame, we're talking about peripheral vascular disease, poorly controlled ulcers, toes which are starting to rot, and then and ultimately end up with diabetic foot ulceration and then amputation. Then we're also looking at wound healing problems in general associated with major surgery, and particularly lower limb surgery. And again, it comes down to microcirculation. So it's always been on the radar, but my practice in northern Tasmania over 30 years kept on drifting down to looking after more and more patients with diabetic foot complications, mainly because most surgeons, just not interested. If you go to a foot and ankle orthopedic meeting, which is really boring anyway, but you'll go for 3 or 4 days, and 95% of the operations and the procedures and the conditions that are discussed are not diabetic.
Yeah.
Literally, this soreness, this problem, this arthritis, this management, these intricate operations. Whereas when I came to my public hospital work, 95% of my foot and ankle practice, and which became a major portion of my clinics on a Friday, because just with diabetic foot problems, because nobody else would look after them. We didn't have a major vascular service, so I was giving vascular opinions. I was looking after the foot problems. There were ulcers. We had lots of contact casts on. We'd try and conservative management, and I was losing it. I was losing the battle. My patients were losing the battle. And not surprisingly, my clinic ended up being called Fettke's Effed Up Fructose-Free Fungating Foot Folly Fridays. It takes a little while to roll off it.
I think that's fabulous, yeah.
But it used to be. And I'd get medical students in there and I'd say, look, if you turn up to my clinic on a Friday, I'll guarantee that you'll pass medicine. which was, and not because I'm actually a great teacher. It's just if you're a medical student and you turn up to a clinic on a Friday afternoon when you can nick off early, and you come along and see all these horrible problems, I'd be scratching my head. Not just diabetes, but my clinic was, whenever there wasn't a problem, what do you do with a patient? They ended up in my clinic. And a few years ago, quite proudly, my registrars actually gave me a toilet brush painted gold. A golden toilet brush, because in my clinic I got to clean up all the, whatever.
Yeah.
And so I've actually had that for the last few years, sitting directly behind my patients. So I'm seeing them and they're sitting facing me, but directly behind them is a golden toilet brush. And when they do have one of those diabolical problems, which are unsolvable or need a bit of lateral thinking, I say turn around, because you're actually one of those toilet brushes. You're here because nobody else knows what to do with you. Would you consider this?
Yeah.
Now, I'm quite happy that I'm a problem-solving surgeon and thinking outside of the box. But the diabetes was, there was a point in time when one day I had a patient, nice guy. I'd amputated one leg. We were looking at amputating the other leg. We got him in hospital, out of control diabetes. And I went and caught up with him at a mealtime, and he's eating ice cream. I said, hang on, what are you eating ice cream for? And he said, I like ice cream. I said, well, it's no good for your blood glucose control. Yeah. And he said, no, I'm allowed to have it in hospital. And then I started looking into it, and I was starting to look at the perils and problems of sugar in a wider extent rather than just surgery. And then I started realising that this is the example we're setting in hospitals, 100%. Not just to people with diabetes, but for the wider community. Yeah. Supposed to be pillars of health, as a hospital. And they're just, they're the slums of the worst possible food that you can possibly supply to people, both in protein content, carbohydrate, glucose control, micronutrients, the whole works, just a total joke. But the hospital, in their defence, were actually following the National Hospital Food Guidelines.
Yeah.
And when I started challenging it, they said, look, you're going to have to take on the hospital food guidelines. You're going to have to change them. I said, well, I'm just an orthopaedic surgeon in Tasmania, but I'll give it a crack.
As you do.
And I was given the opportunity to speak to the national body, the National Conference of the Hospital Food. You wouldn't be surprised, but the hospital food nursing home has a national body. They meet once a year. And I got to speak and do a plenary talk to their audience, which was pretty high profile. My second slide, and I'll come back to it, but my second slide was hospital food is crap and it's killing my patients.
Absolutely.
Let's get their attention.
Mm.
And because if you're setting a poor example of food, particularly recommending people to have high-dose carbohydrate and sugars in hospital, and no wonder their blood glucose is out of control. And it doesn't kill them directly, but over time it sets a poor example. One of the times I was reported to the medical board and investigated, I was reported 3 times by effectively the cereal and the processed food industry, and their accomplices. But one of them I'd been charged, for want of a better term, of inappropriately reversing someone's diabetes. And I'd made a claim that hospital food was killing my patients. It's crap and it's killing my patients.
Yeah.
So they'd taken my slide that I'd given in a public talk. They then actually wrote to the hospital to find out how many of my patients had directly died from hospital food. So this is the medical board. They're going to the nth degree. The hospital said, we've gone through the records. None of Dr. Fettke's patients have died from hospital food, so he's exaggerating. I said, it's a figure of effing speech,
Unbelievable. Yeah.
But the fact is we've got a system in place that's that draconian. It chases things down. You're guilty until proven otherwise. I'm sorry, the medical investigatory system here in Australia is that you are guilty until proven innocent. And I've now been through this process myself a few times. I'm supporting people on a daily and weekly basis who are going through the same process. It's terrible. It's created defensive medicine.
We have the same in the UK, and I was reading, I'm a pharmacist. My partner's a GP, or I don't know whether you call them a GP in Oz or a family physician, but I often read...
Call them nice people.
They're nice people, yeah. The number of GPs and other medical doctors who've committed suicide during the investigatory period. So yeah, the system has.
If you're under investigation, you have, was it? It's been
Yeah.
looked at 14 times, I think, the suicide rate in comparison with the general population.
Well, it's interesting because your story about hospital food, got a little anecdote of my own. My father's also a pharmacist. We're a bit of a pharmacy family. My son's a pharmacist, so kind of sad group, really. And
none of our children have gone into medicine. We're quite happy. We're very proud of that.
So he's 90, my dad now, 90, yeah, morbidly obese, and has never, he's got literally a brain the size of a planet. I don't know if I'm sure you know the drug Imodium. That was his PhD.
Okay.
And I don't know if you remember the drug Fortral.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So
I am that old.
Right. So he did a lot of work he became a community pharmacist, but he was originally a pharmaceutical chemist, and he did lots of research around the morphine molecule and playing with the different bits of the molecule in order, because morphine has all these different effects, and you can, by playing with the molecule, you can modulate the molecule and get the pain-killing activity, the anticholinergic activity, etc., etc. Anyway, seriously bright guy, but completely intellectual, and has never moved. No physical activity was ever something encouraged in our family, because the only valuable thing was intellectual movement. So spent his life never moving and eating terrible food, but has made it to 90, and he's physically frail, but his brain is still the size of a planet. So as a result, we get a phone call from the hospital, the Royal Berkshire Hospital, saying, your dad's in hospital, he's may not make it. So Karen and I jump in the car. We were at a dinner party. We drive down. It's about an hour's drive. We get there, and he's been tied up in a suit because the infections made him go completely doolally. And he's literally, unrecognizable as an adult. I want my mummy and things like that. Anyway, long story short, they pump him. It turned out to be a UTI. They pump him full of antibiotics. Mm-hmm. He starts to recover. And at one point, Karen said to me, I think your dad, because we were watching him, and she said, I think your dad's passed away. And I said, no, he's just got really severe sleep apnea. It's the most heroic sleep apnea you've ever seen. And he'll literally stop breathing, and then he'll go and come back to life, right? So here's a guy who's got sleep. They didn't pick up on his sleep apnea, but they saved his life. So I was there, he was recovering, and I went there a few days later, right?
Well, hospitals are about crisis management.
Exactly.
Sort out the big problem, get him out the door.
Yeah. So he's there a few days.
Remember, forgetting that all the other stuff is the one which is going to bring them back again.
100%. So they then move him to a rehab ward. And as I say, I'm really grateful because they saved his life. So I'm there on a Sunday, right? And they bring him his food. I think there's a plate of white sandwiches with white bread, sweet tea and biscuits. There's a sort of thin soup with a certain amount of vegetables in it, then ice cream. And I think, I just worked it out. It was just sugar, and sugar, and almost no nutrition. And here's a guy who's morbidly obese, right? And I thought, well, if he wasn't diabetic when he came into hospital, he sure as hell will be. So I emailed,
I've had some patients, right on that term there, people have gone low carb with their diabetes management who have told me that when they're at home, they don't have diabetes, and when they're in hospital, they do.
Yeah.
Purely based on what food they're served.
Yeah.
They said, can I go home so I don't have diabetes again? I said, of course you can go home.
100%. So I emailed the ward and said, what are you doing? And they said, what's the problem? And I said, well, you've got a morbidly obese guy and you're feeding him sugar. Have you got shares in type 2 diabetes? And they said, well, we're just following the hospital guidelines. And as far as we're concerned, there's no problem with your father's nutrition because he's not underweight.
No, but I can't, the figure off the top of my head's not there, but it's in the ballpark of 50-60% of people who are obese are actually malnourished, undernourished.
Absolutely.
And 75-80% of people who actually go to hospital are actually malnourished. It doesn't matter about their weight.
Yeah. And
that's a huge thing about, what you're talking about, what I'm talking about is that with people eating a nutrient poor, energy-dense diet over a long period of time means the body, they want the nutrients, so it's not there. So they'll go and eat a second pizza because the first pizza didn't have it.
And I think you're absolutely right. I don't think people realise is that the body's got all sorts of nutrient sensing mechanisms. And the mechanism will only be satiated when it's got enough of the nutrients. So the example I always give is if you've got half the micronutrient, I mean, it's a theoretical case, but if you've got food that's got twice as much calories and half as much nutrition, you want to keep on eating and eating and eating until you get the nutrition. Well, of course, if it's not there, you will never be satiated and all the normal satiety mechanisms are bypassed.
I mean, you and I get it, and more people do get it. But the fact is, we've got these systems entrenched that don't want to actually admit that they got it wrong. I mean, if the hospital has to admit that the hospital food is making the people sicker, then everyone's worried about the legalities and being sued and that sort of thing. And so, I've been battling this system for 12 years now, at multiple levels, and we still are. And there's some projects that we've still got going at this point in time, and some exciting new stuff. But it's trying to work out where you put that energy. So what's really critical, and that's what you're doing, but is that the individual can make the decision about what they want to do with their health, their nutrition, and their life. They can make that decision today. That's an incredibly empowering moment for people if they want to embrace it. And the trouble is picking out, is our noise, is what I'm talking about more relevant than someone else's? Because there's a whole lot of disinformation out there. I call it disinformation. It's deliberate misinformation. 100%. Because we've got a food industry and a sickness industry that needs to be maintained. And, therefore, I should declare my conflicts of interest. I'm not being paid, okay? And last year I've been asked to be a red meat ambassador to the meat and livestock industry here in Australia. I've not received a cent for that recognition, okay? So these are, but I'm not selling a book. I'm not promoting anything. I've been in books and I've been in some movies and whatever, but I don't make money from this. All this has done is cost Belinda and myself an enormous amount of time, effort, anxiety, stress, and money. I mean, it's cost us a retirement fund. If anybody wants to throw us a retirement fund, it'll be nice. No orthopaedic surgeon ever's gone starving, by the way, and certainly. My financial advice to everyone, we're just a couple of state school kids, but if you stay married to each other, you'll be fine.
So let me just complete my dad's story. So I emailed the ward, and they put the dietitian or nutritionist, whoever was advised the ward, said, as far as we're concerned, there's no problem. Do you want to speak to the ward consultant? So I emailed the ward consultant. He said, well, I'm the consultant to the ward, but I have absolutely no interest or control on any of the nutrition. I went round in circles for a while. And in the end, they said, do you want to make a formal complaint? So I thought they provided fantastic care for my dad in many ways, saved his life. I really don't want to go down the route of making a formal complaint and tying everyone up in red tape and unpleasantness. And I left it. But, it's the same. You go to all these professional meetings, in the health system, and you've got GPs and consultants and whatever. And what do they feed? You go there halfway through, you get, a jam, chocolate croissant, orange juice. And I stand up and say, have we all got shares in type 2 diabetes? It's madness. It really is. Well, just kind of sorry to interrupt, just circle back, because I interrupted you when we were talking about your surgical role. Because I want people to understand what, because you've seen it up close and personal and many times and had to deal with this. What does it do to the body, out of control diabetes? And, what kind of extremes do you have to go to? I think the NHS annually removes in the UK removes 40,000 limbs a year due to out of control diabetes. So describe that for us.
Once you your life expectancy after an amputation is very poor. It's in the vicinity of less than 5 years on average. And it's because once you lose a limb, it's not just a mobility issue, it's a microvascular issue. And one of the things I talk about in my inflammation talks is that this affects every end blood vessel.
Yeah.
So it affects every tissue in the body. My recent carb talk, which I thought would be more controversial, carbohydrate, the dose is the poison, I actually made an academic scientific argument that the toxic dose of sugar, glucose, is 4 grams or 1 teaspoon. And I haven't been argued down. I mean, the first time I gave it was to 350 doctors. And I thought, okay, come at me and tell me where I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But nobody did. I said, okay, so therefore, the trouble is when you ingest glucose, and this is the person who doesn't have diabetes. This is just all of us. If you ingest glucose, it has multiple effects. But a reasonable dose, and we're talking about 30, 40 grams, which is, 4 slices of bread or a bowl of pasta or rice, what most people are tucking into with an evening meal, that will have an immediate damaging effect on the glycocalyx, which is the lining of every blood vessel, every artery in the body. Now, the glycocalyx is so critically important because it actually allows our blood vessels to flow, for the red blood cells to go through and supply oxygen to the tissues. And when you damage that tissue, that glycocalyx, it takes hours for it to come back. So one meal will damage the glycocalyx immediately. And those people who've got diabetes, their glycocalyx thickness is 1/3 to half of the normal population at the best of times. Then they have more diabetes, more glucose, and then it just continues the compounding effect. So therefore, just on glucose and one meal, it will create a sluggish blood flow in the blood vessels. And at the end point, which is, I call it like a garden or a vegetable garden. What's at the end of the vegetable garden getting the smallest amount of blood supply, of water, is the one which is not going to do that well. It doesn't matter how much nutrients you don't give it, how much fertilizer, how much weed killer, how much snail bait you put out. Unless you put the water supply on there, the thing's never going to come back.
Yeah.
So that's just the glycocalyx aspect. Then there's the atherosclerosis aspect, and then there's more stasis issues where the blood supply is down, so therefore blood tends to clot more in the periphery, out to the end of the body. Then you've got the insulin effect, which is the insulin. When you eat carbohydrates, the pancreas produces this hormone called insulin, and its primary aim is to take the glucose out of the bloodstream. To take it out, it's because the body doesn't like glucose in the bloodstream, takes it out of the bloodstream and pushes it into the tissues and primarily stores it as fat. But 2 other things we've really found out about insulin in the last few years, and particularly just 2 years ago, is insulin is not just a fat storage hormone, it's actually a growth hormone. So it's had a major stimulatory effect on things that grow. What's the biggest thing we're worried about that's growing? It's called cancer.
Absolutely.
So therefore, when people say to me, look, you're telling about reverse cancer or get rid of cancer by going low carb keto, I said, no, I'm saying that stop stimulating the cancer.
Yeah.
And then maybe the body's got a fighting chance. And the chemotherapy and the radiotherapy and surgery are going to have better outcomes if you've got better control of it. But the thing which came out, which is particular relevance to orthopedics, is that the Chinese, actually 2 years ago, 2020, everyone blames the Chinese for bad sort of news and stuff, but they published some great material around insulin and inflammation, and particularly osteoarthritis. Some really, really good stuff, showing that it was really a dose-related effect, osteoarthritis of the knee. The more insulin that you put the thing called synoviocytes, it's the lining cells of the knee.
Yeah.
The more insulin, the more inflammation. Now, 2 things about that. The relevance of that is for my patients and everyone who has osteoarthritis, which is inflammation of joints, I recommend going low carb. It doesn't matter how advanced it is because you're going to reduce the inflammation. Yeah. You're going to reduce it because you might lose a little bit of body weight along the way, but you're actually going to have a direct anti-insulin effect on the inflamed joints. And I've had multiple, hundreds of patients, but I can still remember from last year, 8 patients in 1 week came back to see me where 6 to 8 weeks earlier I'd said, you've got bare bone in your knee, you're needing a knee replacement, but why don't you do this? because just do this for me as we're mucking around planning surgery. 8 patients came back, bare bone arthritis in the knee, saying, I've got no pain.
Yeah.
Now, they virtually hadn't lost weight. A couple of them had lost a kilo here and there, but this was primarily a loss of the inflammation in their joints. And so, obviously, when you see this stuff, you can't unsee it. That's what I keep talking about. When you see,
Absolutely.
you can't ignore a patient who says, thanks, doc, I don't need an operation. But then there's those patients who didn't want to do it, and ultimately not everyone can be as enthusiastic as the next person. And so some of those would stick with me and we'd try and coax them around, or that others would go to see someone else and someone else would do the surgery. And I'm fine with that, because I'm not going to force this upon anyone. I'm just going to say this is a reasonable option. It doesn't cost anything. Side effects are zero. The financial cost is zero. I often say to people, they say, I can't afford to eat fresh food. And I say, well, you've got to, there's no extra monetary cost in eating fresh food. There is a time cost. It takes time to go out and shop for fresh produce. I'll use Karen Zinn's quote from New Zealand. I don't know if you know Karen, but
yeah,
empty pantry, full fridge.
Yeah,
great message. It is. You're going to have a full fridge. You're going to have to go to the shops. You're going to have to buy fresh, and then you're going to have to prepare the food. So it's not costly in money if you're buying fresh, local, seasonal food. It is costly in time. But I say to people, it's really simple. You've got a choice of spending that time preparing the food, cooking quality stuff, making that part of the family, the celebration of eating.
Yeah.
Or you've got a choice of spending that time in my waiting room in 10 or 20 years' time and becoming what I call a medical tourist, moving from, there's so many people who, so many elderly people that their entire life, their calendar, their diary is just filled up with which medical appointment they're going to.
I see that. Both my parents are elderly now, in their late 80s, early 90s. And particularly my mum, all of it, her week is dominated by medical appointments and medical visits. Look, at this stage, she's not going to change anything. She won't. But I kind of don't want to make the same mistakes. And most particularly, my kids are now having kids, so our grandchildren. Karen and I trying to do everything we can to encourage our children not to feed the same things that we fed our kids, because now we know the error of our ways, in order to prevent them having to fight with all this at that end point.
We've apologised to our children for the way we brought them up, but our grandchildren are low carb kids.
Yeah,
and gone through low carb pregnancies. Beautiful, and all I can only say, apart from being a proud grandparent and all that sort of thing, all I can say, that hasn't caused them any harm. I think they're perfectly fine, actually. I think they're ahead on a whole lot of things.
Yeah.
But anecdotally, it hasn't. And also, that's the wonderful thing about social media and lectures and giving talks, is that you actually get this feedback from tens of thousands of people. And all of a sudden, your N equals 1 study becomes N equals 10 or N equals 100 or N equals 1,000, just anecdotally. And I think that's been another project I was supposed to do. We were supposed to start that all at the beginning of COVID, called the N equals 1 study, and try and collate tens of thousands of cases around the world. So I apologise to your listeners if you heard me talk about this 2 years ago. I've been somewhat distracted, and the world's more chaotic, and it's on my to-do list, along with with a number of books that I need to read, which we talked about and laughed about.
Yeah. Well, when you move ahead with that, please, I'd love to support that.
Look, it's such a good idea. I suppose we need, it's one of those things, not that I need it, but we need seed money, we need seed energy, and we had the energy, but COVID sort of came along and ripped the rug out from underneath us there. Give me time.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. Well, that kind of segues into something else, actually, because you were talking about neonates and so on. And I think it was your daughter's pregnancy and morning sickness that led you to look at the status of the fetus and the fact that we now understand babies in utero and breastfed babies are in ketosis. And-
Look,
go on.
I'm just an orthopedic surgeon, but I
What
deal
do you
with
know?
all sorts of well, that's been an argument.
Yeah.
And he's saying, "Oh, look, he's just a bone cruncher, and he wouldn't, doesn't know anything." But I do actually have a basic medical degree. I've got a Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Science. Our degrees are based in biochemistry, pathology, anatomy. The basic stuff that we're. So I don't have a problem with talking about this. And I'm an enthusiastic, biochemistry student, and I think we're all students until the day we die.
Yeah.
And my father is, similar age to yours, and he still does not go to bed any day until he's learnt something. That's just been his motto in life, and so therefore. If we can all learn something, then that's the goal. So anyway, Kate was unwell, unhappy, and you know the rules of that your wife is only as happy as the unhappiest child. You know that theory? So Belinda was unhappy. Kate was in horrible morning sickness again. So she had fair significant morning sickness with the first bub, but also worse with the second. And she's going. She said, as mothers to be are worried about all that sort. And the old wives' tale is, don't worry about morning sickness. The baby will be fine. Yeah, so that is the anecdotal answer. But she was, chucking up and not eating very well, and I went, "Oh, you're in ketosis, aren't you?" And she went, "What do you mean, Dad?" I said, "Again, you just test her. We've got ketone strips and and she was in ketosis." And it just made me think, and I thought, okay, we've now got this wonderful experiment, because everyone worries about babies in the mother being subjected to smoking, alcohol, drugs, and having this, the mother's got to have a clean, good life, and because otherwise the baby's going to end up with problems. And I thought, actually, we've got an experiment going on here. We have a baby which is in the mother, and the mother's clearly in ketosis. And it made me think, what are has anyone actually looked at this? And as it turns out, if you wanted to design a study to look at whether or not keto or a nutritional ketosis, a state of ketosis was safe, then what you'd like to do is you'd want lots of big numbers, number one. You'd want to control it very carefully. You want to find the most susceptible population you can possibly find, which are going to be growing babies, because the first trimester, second trimester is when everything develops. Then you want to follow them up really carefully. And then you want to follow them once they're born, and see what they're like for the first year or two. Now, surprisingly, right there, hidden in plain sight, are tens of thousands of results of nutritional ketosis.
Yeah.
But nobody's ever gone there. So, I just started, okay, I'm going to start looking at the research here. And so therefore, I think I ended up with about, when you combine, so essentially a meta-analysis, 40, 50,000 cases of severe morning sickness, which means by definition, though, they're in ketosis.
Yeah.
Now, as it turns out, the more severe your morning sickness, for women, not for obviously you and myself, but for the more severe the morning sickness, the better the baby outcomes.
Yeah.
So they're more likely, so the old wives' tale is true, they're more likely to not miscarry, they're more likely to go through to term, they're more likely to be of normal weight, they're more likely to have less congenital abnormalities, and they're more likely to, and they're better, and they have no growth problems, and they are likely to be intellectually smarter at the age of 2. We're not saying we haven't been followed for 20 years. So I thought, oh, well, this is really interesting. I thought, actually, well, what's the opposite side of that? What's the opposite side of keto? Well, it's high carb, isn't it? So what are the results in gestational diabetes? So gestational diabetes tends to be more second and third trimester, but nonetheless, there it is. thousands and thousands, not tens of thousands, but thousands and thousands of results of what the mothers and babies who have gestational diabetes. And guess what? They're more likely to miscarry. They're more likely to have high and low birth weight babies. They're more likely to have birthing problems, far more likely to have congenital abnormalities and other developmental ones like the cardiac ones.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, those children are also a lot more likely to have learning difficulties and are to be sicker. And we know there's some evidence to say that they're more likely to have diabetes and obesity in the longer term. So I realise I'm an orthopaedic surgeon. It's not a big talk. It's not a big presentation. But there it was. It was just fascinating to look at the results. And the old wives' tale is true. Now, gestational diabetes is out of control. That is, it's... one of the anaesthetists I work with, she was diagnosed with gestational diabetes. She's pretty well relatively low carb, but she ended up being diagnosed with it. She's slim, she wasn't overweight.
Yeah.
Now, Belinda went along with her as a support person to that instructional thing. And Belinda's take-home message, and I won't mention my colleague's name, but Belinda's take-home message was, they have no idea what's going on. It's out of control. They're saying to these mothers, if you don't eat 3 meals of carbohydrate per day, next week we're going to put you on insulin, which is just
I mean, it's bonkers,
crazy.
isn't it? Absolutely bonkers. It's like saying, I'm an alcoholic. Oh, well, the way to control your DTs, we'll just give you more alcohol. It's insane. It's unscientific. It's unfathomable.
But it's what the textbooks say.
I know.
It's what the guidelines write.
We've had the same experience in our own family with one of Karen's daughters when she was pregnant, that they wanted, they do all these tests, they do an OGTT in pregnant women, and they were trying to,
oral glucose tolerance test for those people who don't know what OGTT is.
Yeah.
I'm an orthopaedic surgeon, sorry, don't know these things.
Of course not. So it's a great big drink of glucose, and then what you track is how the blood glucose responds. If you're really clever, which no one does, you also track the insulin, but that's a whole other discussion. So they forced her to eat high carb in order to do this test, right? And we got her low carb, so she didn't have 20 atmospheres of insulin hanging around in the first place. Because most people, they've got all this insulin going on all the time in the body's full-on attempt to control the sugar because they're eating such an excess of sugar. So the whole thing is, honestly, it's looking through the wrong end of the telescope. I run out of metaphors, to be honest.
The pyramid needs to be upended.
Yeah.
Just talking about that oral glucose tolerance test in pregnancy. If you are running low carb or keto through your pregnancy, you are more likely to be positive on an oral glucose tolerance test because you haven't been used to that glucose for X number of months. So you can biohack your glucose tolerance test. Sorry, this is for those women who are actually engaging in low carb and keto and feeling good and feeling great and getting good control. You're more likely to have a false positive
absolutely.
OGTT. Yeah. One way of biohacking that is to actually have some, heaven forbid, complex carbohydrates in the form of grains for 2 to 3 days beforehand, just so that you bump it up. Yeah. I'm not telling you to go out and have, ice creams and, that sort of thing. Some complex carbs, which are going to increase your glycemic load and just bump your insulin up a little bit without really causing a dramatic spike and affecting the pregnancy. And our daughter did that. She said, I've got to have this test. I said, will you just do me a favour and have some complex carbs for the next
in your head, you're screaming, aren't you? It's just, we did exactly the same.
And she sailed through it. Nobody batted an eyelid. And so, but she, just in case she had come through as a false positive, because once you come through as a false positive, you've created a number in the system, and the system is after you. You've got to turn up to this test. You've got to do that one. If you don't turn up to this test, then you are a neglectful mother. Yeah. Then you've got child services chasing you down. And that opens up a whole nother pan. I don't know if you've heard of type 1 grit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So R.D. Dykman, who started that group. We were very proud that myself and a few others supported them right at the beginning. But they were up against child services because they had their son unbelievably well controlled by low carb as an 8 and 9, 10-year-old.
Yeah.
But child services were after them, and there have been multiple stories of that around the world. Parents that are taking control of their kids' outcomes with poorly controlled type 1 diabetes. And the type 1 grit group, to put low carb in context, those children, the people doing low carb and type 1, which is the most poorly controlled one, are in the best 0.1% controlled type 1s in the world.
Yeah.
The type 1 grit group have been, looked at, studied with, again, lots of N=1 studies. If you want to control your type 1s, go low carb.
100%. And actually, the next guest on my podcast is Dr. Ian Lake. Do you know Ian?
Yes.
Right.
I know Ian. I've met Ian in Zoe Harkham's backyard. He came over the fence, an intruder. We brought out shotgun and sorted him out. No. He was a guest.
Yeah. For the audience, Ian is a family doctor. He's a GP. He's type 1 diabetic and low carb, and he's got a fantastic website all about how the answer to type 1 diabetes is to be keto and very low carb. So coming back,
you'll talk to him about the law of small numbers from, and that low carb, low insulin, low spikes, low lows.
100%. Yeah,
it just works.
But the point I guess we're trying to get to with this example of ketosis in pregnancy and in neonates is that either nature's 2 million years of evolution is completely stupid, or there's some logic that says, well, if babies in utero and breastfed babies are in ketosis, and that's human beings at their most vulnerable, ketosis must be our natural state, certainly much of the time.
I think rather than its natural state, it's its safe mode of operating. When everything else is bad and you don't have access to food, you move into ketosis. And as a bonus, there are cleansing mechanisms. It cleans up our nuclei in the cells, the mitochondria.
Yeah.
All religions observe fasting for its benefits.
Yeah.
So our religious heritage, doesn't matter if we're Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or whatever, have all observed periods of fasting for their benefits, periods of clarity. And all we're doing is now applying some biochemistry to religion.
Yeah.
That was another talk I did, the biochemistry of religion.
I haven't seen that one. We'll definitely have to link.
It's only a short one, and I presented it over in Cape Town originally as part of the talk, and then and I rang up this professor of biochemistry, and who is describes me as his most enthusiastic, mature age student. And I rang him up and said, "Look, I've worked out the biochemistry of religion." This was a Friday afternoon, and he said, "Fettke, you've lost the plot again. Somewhat more expletives than that." I said, "No, I've worked it out." And I said, "I'll give you till Sunday to work out the biochemistry of religion." And I rang him back on the Sunday, and I said, "I've got it." He said, "Have you worked that out?" And I told him nutritional ketosis, and he went, "Oh, yeah. Yes, okay, all right, you win." Yeah. So, but it's again, this stuff that most of it I talk about, I call it hidden in plain sight.
Yeah.
It's when you go looking for it, you find it. What I've talked about with pregnancy and ketosis. Well, that we actually observed this forever. We've observed this with religious, science. We've observed that adding more and more processed food into our lives hasn't improved our health. And when we take it out, it improves our health. Mind you, it doesn't improve the health of those industries.
It's
and
interesting.
I've been targeted for that.
Completely. So I don't know if you follow Michael Mosley at all, Dr. Michael Mosley and the original five. So what actually got me into all this actually was Michael Mosley's original program, Eat, Fast and Live Longer. And that was how he stumbled across the 5-2 diet. And he describes the American Dust Bowl and during the Great Depression when Americans were starving. And this is what do you think happened to life expectancy in that period of starvation? Well, it increased by 5 years.
Absolutely. My claim to fame is that we did a thing called the Saving Australia. I'm losing my voice, Graham. Sorry. Saving Australia diet, and then my patient was up against Michael Mosley's patient, and we were both up against a patient from the Dietitians Association. My patient beat Michael's patient, and both of our patients smashed the dietitians one.
Yeah.
So it was started at primetime TV, but the advertisers started working out where we were heading with it, and it started going to later and later as the results came through. And my criticism of Michael, and I've been quite open about it. And it's not because he's a bad guy. Is I say, okay, your 800 calorie diet for reversing diabetes works. It's very low carb.
Yeah.
What do you do after 8 weeks?
No, I agree with you. I feel that Michael's somewhat been taken in by all these things. So that this in the UK, the great latest innovation is these NHS shakes. The health system could abstract food into shakes. And okay, they're low carb, so you're starving hungry, but you lose some weight, but they're full of seed oil. Which they're
full of seed oil.
Yeah.
And that virtually all the studies, the investigators have a conflict of interest.
Yeah. So
financial.
Yeah, I've also
and again, it works. It works because you've starved the people into a less diabetic state.
Yeah.
For 8 weeks or 12 weeks. But what do you do after that? And we're advocating for fresh, local, seasonal, whole food.
100%.
Someone's making a lot of money in that.
They have.
I know who it is. We've if you follow us on Twitter and social media, you'll know exactly where we've pointed the finger there.
Yeah,
because they're compromised. I'm sorry, you're compromised if you're actually, and the product is not only just being people having financial interest in it, pyramid selling, and you've actually got the suppliers of those shakes actually involved in developing guidelines.
100%. So the thorny subject of religion came up, and religion is kind of threaded through all of this, and it's also threaded through your journey. And there's a wonderful talk that I saw. I think you and Belinda were both there when you talked about Cain and Abel, and the Garden of Eden diet and the Seventh-day Adventist, which is threaded through all of this. And I've got to learn a lot about this, through yourself and Belinda and Nina Teicholz and so on. Just tell us a bit about how that's been threaded through everything from what we eat, medical education, to the guidelines, to the cereal industry. It's.
I think it's about 7 hours of YouTube talks there now. You've just asked
I am very sad, Gary. I'm a pharmacist. What do you expect? That's what we're supposed to be, Oh,
no, don't ask me to comment on that. Look, religion in all of its forms is a guiding influence on society and how to behave, how to live, and not surprisingly, how to eat. And when you find out that, and as you've asked me about my fruit talk, right at the beginning, the original sin was God said, don't eat the fruit because it's got fructose in it. It's high carb, and it will drive behaviour. And fruit is, it tastes great. But what we've come to recognise is the fructose in particular, but also the sugar in it, the glucose in combination, drives behaviour.
Yeah.
So right from the word go, God said, don't eat the fruit. right from the word go in Genesis, Cain and Abel, sons of Adam and Eve, Cain kills Abel in a jealous rage. And what people haven't really looked at was what was the rage about?
Yeah.
So Cain was the farmer that gave an offering of fruit and grain and cereals to God. Abel was the shepherd who gave an offering of lamb, according to whichever interpretation of the Bible, but an offering of meat to God. Yeah. And God favoured Cain. God favoured Abel, and then Cain killed him in a jealous rage in the field. So we've got right at the beginning there to say, actually, God says an animal-based diet is probably better for you than the plant-based one. And as we extrapolate that down the pathways, an animal-based diet is complete from a nutritional profile. Yep. Macronutrients, micronutrients, proteins, fats, and the small amount of carbs that come with it. A plant-based diet is nutrient poor, carbohydrate rich, energy dense, and as we alluded to before, you just keep chasing your tail trying to find your micronutrient requirements. So the Bible's there, as we talked about fasting, all of these things, and feasting and fasting and what animals should be eaten in and out of cycles, and whether or not it's Hindu or Judaism, they all talk about how to eat. And it's interesting, a lot of that, some of those ideas of not eating this meat or that meat comes because of lack of refrigeration.
Yeah.
But, if you get, and that's why they used to have a feast of an animal rather than try and store the animal. So, obviously you go through it with rose-coloured glasses when you start looking at religion again and then looking at it from a food aspect. And it's fine to have that. But the problem that we found is that the dietary guidelines, those hospital food guidelines, which are the same as the dietary guidelines, which are what is then determines what food is served in hospitals, nursing homes, schools, prisons and armed services. It literally has this massive effect of what food you should eat, has been developed by those with vested interests.
Yeah.
Now, again, if you've got an idea and you have an opinion, I'm happy to listen to your opinion, but I'm really, really interested in how you form that opinion.
Yeah.
So when we actually look at the biochemistry and the science of the food guidelines, it's just nonsense. It is crap and it is killing my patients.
Yeah.
So therefore, how do we get to these guidelines? As it turns out, and this is to cut a whole lot into a short, is that the processed food industry has been right there at the beginning of developing the food guidelines for the Western world. And we can go back to October 23, 1917, when the American Dietetics Association was formed in the US. That was formed, the woman who started that and got that running was a woman called Lena Cooper, who was working at the time and previously for John Harvey Kellogg's and the Kellogg's family and the Kellogg's consortium. And when you start looking back at it, Kellogg's, 101 cereal companies formed in a place called Battle Creek, Michigan, all with the common ground that they were formed from mostly members who were Seventh-day Adventists.
Yeah.
Now, the Seventh-day Adventists are essentially vegan. Mm. They are now the second biggest educator in the Western world after the Catholic Church. They effectively own the cereal industry of the world, the soy industry, and they started the fake and alternate meat industries. And they've been writing the guidelines since October 1917. And the Australian, the UK, the British, the Canadian, South African, New Zealand dietetic associations formed on the back of the American one. Lena Cooper wrote for the first 40 years the textbooks, which then formed the dietetic education for the Western world. She was also the first dietitian appointed by the US military to then determine, food for the forces. But you've got to realise, okay, that'd be fine, except that they're vegan. Yeah. And they actually are promoting their cereal and grains and that whole food pyramid of that varies from 6 to 11 servings of grains at the bottom of the food pyramid. right through to the recommendations of vegetarianism and veganism actually being useful, and right through to the most recent 2020-21 guidelines that came out of the US. The 4 people that were actually looking at the meat aspect, or the saturated fat, and it's, in other terms, they're looking at meat. 3, one was from the processed food industry, the other 3 were vegan, vegetarian, and one of them was Seventh-day Adventist.
Yeah.
Who's incredibly well written. That's fine. You can have your opinion, but you shouldn't be forcing your religious, non-scientific beliefs upon us. Now, everything I've talked about in Belinda's work has actually been acknowledged by the Adventist Church themselves. She's been contacted by past members, current members. Some of the highest people within the Adventist Church have actually acknowledged that Belinda's work is actually accurate. And she's now quoted in those articles as actually knowing, they reference her work about her knowing. So they have actively, and they're quite open about it, manipulated the dietary guidelines to move us away from animal-based produce towards plant-based produce. And I'm sorry, but here it is. The material that they're making up, it's fabricated. The research is done with a religious purpose.
Yeah.
We've got the documents, 1950s here. We are now going to do research to prove the writings of Ellen G. White. We're going to prove what she said, that veganism is a good idea. And then those studies, which are actually done by the vegan processed food industry, then get requoted over and over and over and over. And that's led me down the environmental pathway as well to start looking at that, because the whole thing that plant-based produce is infinitely better for the planet than animal-based produce. So again, it's just, I'm sick and tired of kicking over houses of cards. Right? It's like when I embarked on this journey.
We need you.
But whether or not you just question hospital food. This is a freaking house of cards.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at sugar. Let's look at the metabolism. Hang on, this is really obvious.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be having so much sugar. That sounds really simple now, but I can tell you 12 years ago, people looked as though I'd come from the other side of the moon.
Yeah.
And, and when you start, but again, it's fine for us to have these opinions, but we need to work out how we develop them. And then that's when you start looking at religion. October 1917, 1910, which has a direct effect on our lives, is that the Flexner report came out in the US. It was commissioned by Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller. So steel and oil, the birth of the pharmaceutical industry to get rid of holistic healthcare.
Yeah.
So therefore, that whole preventative health message was played down.
Yeah.
And the operate or to medicate pathways were pushed up.
Absolutely.
And those foundations then determined the research facilities for the next 100 years out of the US. Those models, the hospital model, the massive hospital model, was based on the Battle Creek, Michigan one, which was actually started by John Harvey Kellogg. Yeah. So you throw the Kellogg's together with the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, our entire medical education and nutritional education was screwed up in that 10-year period.
Yeah.
It then became the writings in the textbooks, and then I call that generational education.
Yeah.
So that you don't argue with your teachers because they must know. But they don't argue with their teachers because they must know.
Yeah.
But how did they get there? And that's the fascinating thing. And we demonise Ansel Keys and a whole lot of this. But how did he get to those ideas? And a little known effect, I don't know if you know about Ansel Keys, that he did most of his primary work with the starvation diet.
Yeah.
Okay, remember, and that's how he did his seminal work, which gave him the prominence.
Yeah.
Who did he do those experiments on?
It was a lot of work on prisoners, wasn't it?
Well, no, they were the conscientious objectors to the Second World War.
Yeah.
Okay, who were the conscientious objectors?
You're going to tell me it's the Seventh-day Adventists.
Seventh-day Adventists. Do not draw arms upon fellow man.
Yeah.
So he had this massive we can't find those records. But that is, you look at conscientious objection, Second World War. There was a movie a couple of years ago about an army medic who saved a lot of soldiers by his efforts. He was Seventh-day Adventist. So the conscientious objectors, the health people within the armed forces, they were so Ansel Keys would have met and had been affected by a whole lot of people who were quite happy to be experimented on because that was their war effort.
Yeah, okay.
But they were vegan, vegetarian, Seventh-day Adventists with a deep spiritual thing. So just how did he get to that idea that meat was bad? I mean, I don't know. We can't go back. Ansel Keys is dead, as we alluded to. He's tried to, turn around some of his ideas, in his latter years. But I actually think Ansel Keys was a product of his environment, remembering that the nutritional industry, the nutritional educational industry was being set up by the processed food industry when he would have been medical student, young man, going through that whole thing. So we've got the whole processed food industry really hammering their anti-meat message at that point in time because they didn't know any better. I don't know the answer, but it's just, Ansel Keys gets hammered, but gosh, he was educated by the environment around him.
And I think that's why we ended up in this paradigm of big food and big pharma. And that's why I've ended up calling myself the pharmacist that gave up drugs. Because I've just realised, the drugs are of very little benefit in most people. And if you can get them on the right lifestyle, they don't need the drugs. But of course, the drug industry is never going to do a clinical trial showing that you don't need drugs. And the food industry is never going to encourage people to eat less or eat real food.
If you put the right fuel in your car, it doesn't need a lot of servicing.
Yep.
It's as simple as that. And we pay more attention to what fuel we put in our cars.
Yeah.
And how much it costs and not costs. We'll pay for good quality fuel because we don't want problems with our cars. Well, it's just, as I say to people, just spend the time preparing food. We're very fortunate here in Tasmania. We've got fabulous access to fresh, local, seasonal whole food. We've got our vegetable garden. I've got sheep out there. If I get really desperate, I've got a few wallabies floating around. And they don't float. Sorry, okay, they hop. Okay, all right.
We don't get a lot of those in the UK. We get some urban foxes. Will that do?
Yeah, they probably need a shotgun for those, right?
Yeah. Amazing. So there are so many things that we could have talked about. We've only scratched the surface of the numerous themes that you've tackled. And, like all the people I interview on this channel, I really have to I feel humbled when I read what you guys have done and the fact that you're prepared to spend some time with me. So it's hugely appreciated. Just as we sort of segue towards the end, how do you see the future? So you've been through all this personal pain, and we've only touched on some of it. You've uncovered all this corruption. Where do you think we're heading? At the end of the day, have you got an optimism about the future that the truth will out? Or do you think that the two huge paradigms of big food and big pharma are winning the battle and it's all hopeless?
I think if you are given the right information, you can make decisions for yourself. If you are privileged enough to then be in a situation where you can actually get access to fresh food and avoid the ultra-processed food, then you should embrace that. I'm well aware that there are multiple areas on the planet that don't have access to that information. And even if they did, they don't have access to that good food. So I'm in a privileged position. And if you're in a privileged position, which means you're in Western society and you're not being bombed and you're not, caught up with famine and political, without going down all those paths, then it's your duty to your fellow man to make the most of that.
Yeah.
And if you don't, that's called selfish. So if you want to go along and if you want to continue to fund big food, big pharma, then that's what you're going to do.
Yeah.
Now, I have a problem with that. So again, if you're going to wait for the governments who are influenced by the dollar and the advertising, if you're going to wait for the guidelines to change, you're going to be waiting a long time.
Yeah.
But you can make that decision today about what you are going to do. Now, when the sugar stuff started here in Australia, Sarah Wilson brought out a book called I Quit Sugar. And I went to the two major corporates, Coles and Woolworths, which are the big food suppliers here, and I wrote to both of them saying, I'd like to have a meeting. I realise that's arrogant and out there, right? Anyway, one of them actually wrote back and said, we'd like to have a meeting with you. I said, okay. I know for a fact that Sarah Wilson has sold 80,000 books called I Quit Sugar here in the last 3 weeks. That's 80,000 families which are going to be changing their eating habits at your stores. I want you to know that I've already noted you've moved stevia from this shelf to that one. Yeah. I'm not agreeing with stevia, but I'm just sort of, that's a whole guess who started the stevia industry?
Yeah.
Seventh-day Adventists, okay? They just sold it all off about a year ago, but they started it all. So, and the corporates, and I said, and I know that you're shrinking your fruit juice section.
Yeah.
You're not going to shrink your soft drink section, but so when I started this process, and I'll go back, it's 12 years, when everyone thought that it was completely out of left field to start talking about the perils of sugar. The dentists have been talking about it for 50 years and so have the naturopaths, but to actually become a mainstream topic was unheard of. I was playing golf today because that's what I can do, So I played golf with a guy and I said, you heard about keto? And he said, yeah, everyone knows about keto. And I said, whoa. Let's take you back 5 years. Most people would never heard about the word keto.
Yeah.
10 years ago, I didn't even know what keto was.
Same. Yeah.
So the fact that parents are raising their kids, and a lot of them are saying you can't have that much sugar. The understanding of the word keto, the understanding of low carb in diabetes management is now becoming commonplace. So I can talk to someone on the golf course about it, and he was a finance person.
Yeah.
We're winning. And because I've got the internal documents from the cereal industry back in 2014 saying cereal sales are down in Australia because of the concepts of low carb, paleo. And these 8 people are to be targeted. So in 2014, right at the beginning of all this, they're starting to feel the pain.
Yeah.
So the cereal industry must be feeling the pain because it's got it on their internal documents. So, we've got them on sugar. We've got them on carbs. Yeah. So what's their last bastion of defence?
The planet.
No, fibre.
Oh, fibre, okay. Yeah.
You keep hearing about the benefits of breakfast cereals for fibre.
Yeah.
And there's a whole other topic about whether or not fibre is good or bad for you. But what I'm sort of saying is we're pushing the processed food industry into a corner.
Yeah.
The consumer's doing that. They're never going to go out of business. But don't forget that you as the consumer have the ability to support your local farmer.
Yeah.
You've got the ability to decentralise food back to community. You've got that ability with your buying power. Never underestimate it. Even if you just move 10% of your budget towards the local farmer, that's progress. So am I optimistic? I am for those that have the ability and the option to choose it. The rest of the world, I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit old and pragmatic about that, but I think if you're going to eat well and you can look after your land in a holistic fashion, and that means looking after erosion and considering the environment and all of that, I think there is a future there. Is it going to be at 7 billion people on the planet, or is it going to be at 10 billion or 2 billion? I don't know the answer to that, and that'll be well past me. But I'd like to think that my grandchildren are going to be armed with the tools to go forward with the information which their grandmother said, and they'll go back and go, hey, I'm very proud of my grandparents. I didn't find out a lot about them until only a few years ago, and what they did standing up against the Nazi regime way back. But isn't it a great concept where your actual children and your grandchildren think that you're cool?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we're giving it a crack. Are we going to succeed? No. But I'm no longer one voice. We're no longer just a husband and wife. There are now thousands of people that are starting to run, if not millions. I think there are millions of people, that are on board with it now. And you compare that to, do you know Rod Taylor? You know Rod?
No.
No. So Rod started Low Carb Down Under, and the whole millions of viewings on YouTube and all that.
I know Low Carb Down Under. Karen and I were all intending to come. Of course, then COVID put paid to it, but we definitely will at some point.
Oh, there's a new meeting in May in Sydney. May 14th. Paul Mason just rang me about it the other day. Yeah. But it's free plug, Paul. There you are. Okay. And but I said to Rod, we're in a taxi going from A to B, and I said, another 20 or 30 years, Rod, that people will never remember Rod Taylor, Gary Fettke, Peter Bruckner,
Yeah.
But just remember what got started here.
Absolutely.
And that's all. This is. I know it doesn't. Nobody believes us, but we're actually doing it because we think it's important.
100%. And like you said, was it you that can coin this expression that once you've seen it, you can't unsee it? I know.
I'll take the credit for that, but it gets requoted around the time. But nonetheless,
I quote it all the time, Gary. I quote it all the time.
But that's it. I can't. As I say, when I've got patients that come in, unfortunately, those people with end-stage diabetes and amputations, to be fair, their brains aren't often functioning well enough to turn it around. Yeah. Their families' brains are, and we can have a go at the next generation.
Yeah.
But literally, even people with end-stage diabetes and foot ulcers that are not healing, who go low carb and get control of their diabetes, stave off that amputation for months, if not forever. I've seen people with kidney disease as a result of their diabetes improve, not just hold it at bay, but actually improve. And this stuff is just mind-blowing. It's, you're told this can't happen. You're told the Diabetes Association still are pushing the barrow of this is a chronic progressive disease. That is complete and utter BS. Yeah. It needs to be just smashed down, because for those people given the right information, the right, what Belinda will call SAM, support, accountability and motivation, they've got the ability to take back control. But don't wait for the government to advise you on that.
Brilliant, Gary. I think that's an uplifting a note on which to finish. And I just
and I'm not allowed to talk about the ashes.
That's for our next podcast. There are certain things that, as I said, I mentioned the war once or twice, but I think I got away with it. We're just not going to go there. Gary, thanks so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I know we've only touched on 10% of the subjects that you've covered, and some of those not in any great detail.
Probably only about 2 or 3%. Yeah, get Belinda to come and have a chat to you.
I would love to. So I'm so pleased that you volunteered her in that way. It would be an absolute delight if we could have her on, or both of you on at some point in the future. So thank you so much for your time. It's really appreciated.
No, it's a pleasure. Hope all goes well. We're going to catch up in face-to-face sooner or later.
If you enjoyed the podcast and want to find out more, join our Wellness and ProLongevity Facebook group. Don't forget to subscribe and follow so you never miss an episode, and maybe share to friends and family who might benefit. Finally, if you think you might need help with diabetes, heart disease, or any of the other diseases we discuss, then book a free consultation with Graham. There's absolutely no charge for this, and we would never put you under any pressure. What do you have to lose? Bye for now, and see you for the next episode.